There is no pain quite like being turned away from the place where you were supposed to feel the safest. When your own home, literal or emotional, rejects you, it doesn't just sting. It carves deep questions into your sense of worth. What did I do wrong? Why wasn't I enough? Are you, was it me? Or was it never safe to begin with? Let me start by saying this. Rejection from your own home is not always about who you are. Sometimes it's about the fragility, dysfunction, or fear of the people around you. But when you're a child, or even an adult who longs for connection, you internalize it. You learn to shrink yourself, contort yourself, or hide the most authentic parts of who you are just to belong. But here's the truth. Rejection does not define you. It reveals the limitations of the space you are in. It exposes the emotional bandwidth, or lack thereof, of those who were supposed to care for you. And while that may be heartbreaking, it can also be liberating. Because once you see that rejection clearly, you can stop chasing love where it cannot exist. You can begin the long, brave journey of coming home to yourself. We live in a culture that prizes perfection, silence, and fitting in. But real belonging doesn't require you to be perfect. It requires you to be real. And sometimes being real threatens the people who are still hiding behind masks. That's not your fault. That's your truth shining a light. So today, I invite you to grieve that rejection, to name it, to sit with it, and then to begin building a new kind of home, one rooted in compassion, worthiness, and fierce self-respect. You may have been rejected from your home, but you were never rejected from your own heart. You are allowed to belong to yourself. There's a deep instinctive ache that forms when we are rejected, not just by acquaintances or strangers, but by the people and places we associate with love, safety, and identity. That kind of rejection burrows into our sense of self and whispers dangerous stories about not being enough. We begin to question if our voice was too loud, our needs too heavy, or our truth too inconvenient. It's an almost automatic response to assume that being turned away means we somehow failed at love or belonging. But when we slow down and look closer, we begin to see a more nuanced truth. Not all rejection is a mirror of who we are. Sometimes it's a projection of what others cannot handle. Emotional limitations, especially in family systems, often masquerade as judgment. When people don't have the capacity to deal with vulnerability, complexity, or pain, they may push us away to protect their own fragile equilibrium. Their rejection feels personal, but it is often deeply rooted in fear. Fear of what they don't understand. Fear of what they haven't faced within themselves. Fear of being pulled into emotional depths they don't have the tools to navigate. That fear isn't about us, even if it impacts us. We all have emotional ceilings, thresholds beyond which we struggle to respond with empathy, openness, or understanding. When someone reaches their emotional ceiling and can't go further, they may react with avoidance, criticism, or dismissal. For those of us who express ourselves authentically, whether through honesty, emotional transparency, or the simple act of needing care, that can feel like a personal attack. But their ceiling isn't your fault. If you were told you're a too sensitive, a too intense, or a too much, chances are you are simply brushing up against someone else's boundary for what they can emotionally manage. And instead of saying, I can't hold this, they say, you're wrong for needing this. This dynamic is especially painful in environments that are supposed to be nurturing. Homes, families, long-term relationships, because the rejection feels like a betrayal of something sacred. But instead of absorbing the belief that you are the problem, you must understand the emotional infrastructure they are working with. You may have been a mirror to emotions they never allowed themselves to feel. You may have stirred something raw they didn't know how to hold. And so they closed the door, not because you were wrong, but because you were overwhelmed, because they were overwhelmed. One of the hardest lessons is that not everyone has the capacity to meet you where you are. Some people can't sit with grief without trying to fix it. Some can't handle confrontation without escalating it. Some can't tolerate vulnerability because they were taught it's dangerous. These emotional gaps, this lack of capacity, is not a matter of love. It's a matter of tools. People can love you with all they have and still not have enough to offer you the safety and acceptance you need. And when you're on the receiving end of that gap, it's confusing. It makes you question whether love is supposed to feel conditional. You may have received silence when you needed words. You may have been met with distance when you reached for closeness. That contradiction feels like rejection, and in many ways it is. But it's rejection built on someone else's limitations, not on your lack of worthiness. To navigate this without internalizing it, you must separate your identity from their reaction. Your emotions, your needs, your truths are not wrong because someone couldn't honor them. You are simply asking for connection in a language they never learned to speak. When we internalize rejection, we inherit shame. We begin to believe we are defective, broken, or unlovable. But the reality is, rejection often exposes the breaking points in someone else's emotional resilience, not ours. Understanding this requires deep self-compassion and emotional clarity. It invites us to examine the pain through a lens that doesn't lead back to self-blame. This is not about vilifying the people who rejected us. They may be carrying their own wounds, their own unspoken traumas, their own patterns of survival. But we cannot continue making ourselves smaller to fit inside spaces that were never built to hold us. Emotional limitations are not always chosen. They're often inherited. But recognizing them allows us to stop contorting ourselves in hopes of earning a love that's contingent on our silence. The freedom begins when we acknowledge that rejection may not be proof of our inadequacy. It may be the clearest signal that we were never the problem. It may be the beginning of understanding that our depth requires something more presence, more courage, more capacity from the people who surround us. And if that capacity doesn't exist where we are, it doesn't mean we stop seeking it. It means we stop begging for it. There's a fundamental difference between fitting in and truly belonging, though many of us spend years, even decades, confusing the two. Fitting in asks you to scan the room, the family, the culture, and shapeshift into something that feels acceptable. It's about minimizing the parts of yourself that feel too different, too emotional, or too raw, and magnifying the traits that feel safe and likable. It's a survival strategy, not a soul strategy. Belonging, on the other hand, is something sacred. It is being seen and accepted as you are, not as who someone needs you to be to feel comfortable. And when we grow up in homes, relationships, or communities that only reward performance and conformity, we internalize the belief that we must become less, quieter, calmer, easier to digest in order to be loved. So we start shedding pieces of ourselves. A boundary here, a truth there, a joy too loud, or a sadness too inconvenient. Slowly, we disappear into roles and masks. But that ache that lingers, the loneliness in a room full of people, the exhaustion after being around your loved ones, that's not social anxiety. That's your spirit calling out for belonging, not performance. When you are taught that your fullness is too much, it's tempting to collapse into something smaller just to keep the peace. In many homes, silence is equated with respect, and obedience is mistaken for love. So the child who speaks up is labeled difficult. The teen who questions family norms is dismissed as rebellious. The adult who sets boundaries is accused of being selfish or cold. But none of this is a reflection of who you truly are. It's a reflection of what that environment required in order to feel in control. Belonging in those spaces often becomes a tightrope walk. Say just enough to appear present, but not so much that it shakes the foundation. And if you've ever had to dilute your personality, withhold your pain, or disguise your dreams just to keep a connection, then what you were experiencing was conditional acceptance, not belonging. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing that people loved the edited version of you. The version that knew when to laugh at the right time, nod in agreement, and never push back. But no matter how convincing that edited self becomes, it never feels whole. And wholeness is the birthplace of real belonging. Shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's world may gain you approval, but it comes at the cost of self-trust. Each time you bite your tongue instead of speaking your truth, you chip away at your sense of integrity. Every time you pretend to agree just to avoid conflict, you send your nervous system the message that safety means self-abandonment. This is how people end up feeling lost in their own lives. They're surrounded by others, yet starved for real connection. Because connection can't survive when authenticity is absent. And so the very thing we hope to gain by fitting in, belonging, slips further out of reach. It's a cruel irony. And the longer this pattern continues, the harder it becomes to recognize where the mask ends and the real self begins. Many people don't even realize how much they've been minimizing themselves until they find a space. Maybe a person, maybe a moment, where they don't have to. And in that space, when they speak without censoring, laugh without apologizing, or cry without shame, they realize how much of their life was spent pretending. It's a quiet kind of awakening, but a powerful one, a remembering of self beneath the performance. The need to belong is one of the most deeply human experiences we can have. It's not about ego or weakness. It's about survival and connection. But when belonging is misunderstood as conditional acceptance, we begin a dangerous journey of trading authenticity for proximity. We cling to people, places, and systems that tolerate us instead of celebrating us, and we call it love. We internalize the message that if we just try harder, be easier, less opinionated, more accommodating, we might finally feel like we fit. But belonging was never supposed to feel like work. It's not earned through compliance. It's felt through mutual presence. And when someone only welcomes a fraction of who you are, it's not belonging. It's editing. The spaces that ask you to mute your voice in order to stay close are not sacred. They are conditional. And that kind of proximity always leaves a residue of loneliness. Belonging doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to show up, fully, messily, truthfully. And when that is not met with open arms, the issue is not your size. It's the narrowness of the space trying to contain you. The question is not, how can I be less? It's why am I choosing places where being whole is too much? Pain that goes unnamed doesn't vanish. It embeds itself in the body, in the nervous system, in the stories we tell ourselves when no one is listening. When something hurts deeply, especially rejection from the people or places we once called home, our instinct is often to minimize it. We say, it wasn't that bad, or I should be over it by now. That minimization is not truth-telling. It's survival, because naming the pain makes it real. And when it becomes real, it has to be felt. That's terrifying for many of us. But there's something more dangerous than the fear of feeling. It's the cost of never acknowledging the wound at all, because it heals in the long run. Healing requires an honest confrontation with the hurt we carry. It demands the courage to admit that we are not fine and that we need support. It is in acknowledging the pain that we begin the real work of releasing it instead of holding on to it like a secret. Only when we stop pretending that everything is okay can we start the deep, necessary work of becoming whole again. Pretending we are fine is a defense mechanism born out of fear. We fear that if we admit we're struggling, others will see us as weak, fragile, or incapable. We fear that the weight of our emotional baggage will overwhelm those around us, so we carry it alone, hidden behind a facade. But this hiding places an immense burden on our mental and physical well-being. Bottling up grief, anger, or sadness doesn't make those emotions go away. It only stores them in our bodies, where they manifest in ways we don't even recognize. The tightness in our chest, the constant fatigue, the sudden outbursts of frustration, these are often signs that we've been carrying too much, pretending for too long. The body has a way of speaking when we refuse to listen, and when we ignore the signals, we move further away from true healing. To stop pretending, we must be willing to take off the armor and allow ourselves to be seen, raw and vulnerable. This doesn't mean we throw ourselves into chaos, but rather we acknowledge our pain in safe spaces. We allow ourselves to rest, to break down, to cry. True healing begins when we choose honesty over perfection, when we choose authenticity over the need for approval. Healing cannot happen without vulnerability. And vulnerability requires the strength to be honest with ourselves about where we are and what we feel. So often, we look at our pain and tell ourselves that it's not big enough to warrant attention. We convince ourselves that others have it worse, that our struggles are just part of life, and that we should be able to get over it. Get over it. This self-dismissal is an act of self-protection, but it also keeps us stuck. We cannot heal what we are unwilling to face. The first step is acknowledging our struggles without minimizing them. When we stop pretending, we stop downplaying the impact of our experiences. It's not about creating a narrative of suffering or remaining trapped in the victim mindset. It's about giving ourselves permission to feel without judgment. The process of healing is messy, and it can be uncomfortable. It's often tempting to rush through it or avoid it altogether. But the discomfort is where the growth happens. When we stop pretending to be fine, we allow ourselves the space to feel, to process, and to ultimately release the weight we've been carrying. This is where transformation begins, when we open the door to our pain and allow ourselves to truly heal. The journey of healing is deeply personal, and it's important to remember that it doesn't follow a linear path. We might think that by stopping the pretense and being honest about our pain, we'll immediately feel better, but it doesn't work that way. Healing is layered, messy, and often non-linear. There are moments when we feel like we're making progress, and then there are times when we feel like we've taken steps backward. But each time we choose to acknowledge the pain and not pretend it's not there, we move closer to peace. We become more attuned to our needs, more compassionate toward ourselves, and claim our power. By choosing vulnerability, we embrace the opportunity to grow, to learn, and to connect on a deeper level. It is through this openness that we begin to step into the fullness of who we are, acknowledging that strength is not about never falling, but about being willing to rise again each time we do. When we resist vulnerability, we inadvertently build walls around ourselves, walls that create isolation and disconnection. We might convince ourselves that if we don't show our vulnerability, we'll protect ourselves from hurt. But in reality, it's the walls we build to shield ourselves from pain that also keep us from experiencing connection and joy. Vulnerability is the bridge that allows us to connect with others, genuinely and deeply. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we give others permission to do the same. It's in the shared space of openness that true intimacy is born. The relationships that are built on vulnerability are the ones that are most meaningful because they are founded on trust and authenticity. We're not pretending to be perfect. We're showing up as we are, flawed, messy, and human. And in that rawness, we find connection that goes beyond surface level interaction. By embracing vulnerability, we stop trying to control every aspect of our lives and instead lean into the uncertainty and unpredictability of human experience. It's only in surrendering that need for control that we allow ourselves to experience the richness of life as it unfolds, with all its ups and downs, joys and sorrows. Vulnerability is not a one-time choice. It's a continuous practice, a muscle we must learn to exercise over and over again. At first, being vulnerable may feel terrifying, as though we're exposing ourselves to potential harm. But with each step we take into vulnerability, we learn that the discomfort is temporary and the rewards are profound. Each time we choose to be vulnerable, we deepen our understanding of ourselves. We discover hidden strengths, untapped courage, and a well of resilience that we may have never known existed. Vulnerability requires a level of self-trust that can only be built over time. We must trust that we are enough, even when we don't have all the answers, even when we're unsure of the outcome. And as we practice vulnerability, we begin to see that the discomfort doesn't last. It's the transformation that follows that makes it worth it. Vulnerability isn't about being fearless. It's about being fearless. It's about acknowledging our fear and choosing to move forward anyway. The more we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, the more we cultivate the strength to face whatever comes our way, knowing that we are capable of navigating even the most difficult emotions. The act of being vulnerable requires us to let go of perfectionism. Perfectionism is a defense mechanism designed to protect us from judgment, but it also keeps us locked in a cycle of self-doubt and insecurity. When we try to be perfect, we are constantly measuring ourselves against an impossible standard, and in doing so, we prevent ourselves from fully embracing who we are. Vulnerability, on the other hand, invites us to release that need for perfection and embrace imperfection. It's in our imperfections that we find our humanity, our authenticity, and our connection to others. By acknowledging our flaws and weaknesses, we open the door to deeper self-acceptance. We stop pretending to be something we're not, and instead, we allow ourselves to be seen as we truly are. And in that openness, we discover the freedom to be ourselves, without the pressure of living up to anyone's expectations. Vulnerability teaches us that we don't need to be perfect to be worthy of love, respect, or success. In fact, it's the very willingness to be imperfect that makes us more relatable, more approachable, and ultimately more powerful. The strength in vulnerability lies not in hiding our flaws, but in embracing them as part of our unique, beautiful selves.